Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Today, we're unpacking a stack of sources that really pull back the curtain on the current state of global power dynamics. We're focusing in on how things like trade, diplomacy, and, well, strategic threats are being used to reshape the world right now. You've brought us some truly fascinating material. I mean, it covers everything from recent tariff shakeups to some really high-stakes diplomatic claims and, the shifting sands of international alliances. Our mission today is simple. Sift through these reports, pull out the most important nuggets, and help you understand the powerful forces really at play. We'll look at the bold strategies being used, the economic pressures creating friction, and how these actions are rippling across the globe, influencing international relations, even the price of things you might buy.
Indeed, it's a remarkably complex picture and very fluid. What's particularly striking, I think, in the material we've gathered is how economic and military tools are increasingly intertwined with foreign policy. This isn't just about traditional diplomacy anymore. It's about a very direct, sometimes confrontational approach from various leaders. We'll be exploring the immediate and the long-term implications of these choices. The speed at which dynamics can shift is really something. The boldness of America First diplomacy and direct threats.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Let's start with a look at some truly eyebrow-raising diplomatic claims from former President Trump, now back in his second term. The material you provided shows he's really not shying away from incredibly direct, maybe even shocking threats as a tool of foreign policy. Yeah, one article highlighted Trump claiming he threatened Russian President Vladimir Putin with bombing Moscow if Russian troops moved into Ukraine. Our sources quote Trump using this extraordinarily blunt and frankly aggressive language, claiming he told Putin, "If you go into Ukraine, I'm going to bomb the shit out of Moscow. I'm telling you, I have no choice." And astonishingly, he reportedly added that Putin believed me 10%. It's a remarkable level of bluntness, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And it raises this important question about, well, the nature of deterrence in modern geopolitics, The reports also mention a similar warning, apparently, to Chinese President Xi Jinping over Taiwan. Trump claimed the U.S. would bomb Beijing. He reportedly said of Xi, he thought it was crazy, but then interestingly added, "We never had a problem." This style, as the sources really emphasize, is characterized as this aggressive, very transactional America First approach. It prioritizes strong rhetoric and economic leverage, with Trump basically asserting that such extreme threats successfully prevented problems.
That's just an incredibly direct approach. But do our sources get into maybe the long-term implications of that kind of confrontational diplomacy?
Yeah.
I mean, does it risk alienating allies, even if maybe it deters immediate threats? Trump says it prevented problems, but is there any alternative analysis, maybe suggesting that while it's direct, it might also have, heightened global anxieties or increase the risk of miscalculation?
That's precisely the central debate our sources highlight, yeah. On one hand, you have proponents arguing this unpredictability, this willingness to go to extremes, is exactly what makes the threats credible. It forces adversaries to weigh the consequences more heavily. It's sort of a radical redefinition of deterrence. Not through traditional alliances or subtle signals, but through sheer, often shocking directness. It forces adversaries to take these extreme claims seriously. However, other analyses in our materials suggest a significant downside. Such an approach can erode trust among allies, making them question the reliability, the predictability of U.S. foreign policy. It also creates potentially a higher threshold for conflict, leaving less room for de-escalation through traditional diplomatic channels.
It's also interesting how this directness, as detailed in our sources, seems to extend to domestic issues, too. We see Trump apparently boasting about pressuring wealthy allies for campaign donations and making a pretty stark statement about protesting students. He would throw them out of the country. So what does this all mean for how the U.S. projects power, both externally and internally, and this perceived America First philosophy at its core?
Well, it certainly signals a departure from more traditional diplomatic norms, doesn't it? It favors a very direct and, at times, confrontational projection of power across the board. The underlying philosophy, as the sources seem to indicate, is that this aggressive posture, even with its perceived, craziness, leads to fewer problems and secures American interests first. It's really about leveraging perceived strength to achieve specific outcomes, whether that's on the global stage, pressuring other nations, or domestically, ensuring loyalty and order. It's a very transactional view of power, where every interaction is kind of about perceived gain or loss for the U.S. through the intricacies of the U.S.-China trade war, tariffs as a powerful tool.
And this America First philosophy we've just discussed, with its emphasis on directness and leverage, it's perhaps most dramatically evident, not just diplomatically, but on the economic battlefield. So shifting gears a bit, the Trump administration has significantly escalated its use of tariffs. The reports you've compiled show a truly complex web of duties, all aimed apparently at what's called taking back our economic sovereignty and addressing a massive U.S. goods trade deficit.
Exactly. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, tariffs are presented as, quote, a necessary and powerful tool to put America first. And the numbers are pretty remarkable. As of May 2025, the average U.S. tariff on Chinese goods stands at a whopping 51.1%. That's roughly 1.5 times higher than it was at the start of Trump's second term. And China's average retaliatory tariff on American goods in response is 32.6%.
Wow, 51.1%. That's a huge number. But what does an average tariff of over 50% actually feel like for businesses and ultimately for you, the consumer? Let's try and break down some of these layers because it's not just one single tariff, is it?
Not at all. It's layered.
Right. So first, you have the Section 301 tariffs. These are the long-standing ones, initially imposed way back in 2018. The reason given was perceived unfair trade practices. They affect various lists of goods, typically at 25%. But a recent review has increased rates significantly on specific items. So, for example, electric vehicles now face a 100% tariff. Semiconductors, 50%. Solar cells, 50%. Big jumps.
Huge jumps. Then you have the Section 232 tariffs. These are based on national security concerns, primarily hitting steel, aluminum, and their derivatives, but also automobiles and parts. Rates here have also gone up, steel and aluminum now at 50%. And what's particularly notable, as the sources point out, is that even things like household appliances containing steel and aluminum have been added to this list, also at 50%.
Okay, so 301, 232, and this is the fentanyl tariffs, an additional 20% tariff imposed on all Chinese goods. The stated reason is to stem the flow of precursor chemicals for illicit drugs, but it applies really broadly across the board.
That's right. And then fourth, you have the Liberation Day, or reciprocal tariffs. These were announced in April 2025. They started at 34% on China, but rapidly escalated to 125% after China retaliated. That brought the effective rate potentially as high as 145% for a time. However, there was an agreement on May 14, 2025, that reduced this reciprocal tariff back down to 10% for a 90-day period. So for that specific period, the combined fentanyl and reciprocal tariff became 30%, still significant, but lower than the peak.
And finally, underneath all of this, there's the basic most favored nation MFN tariff.
Exactly. That's the baseline rate, around 3.3%, which applies to pretty much all imports under standard WTO rules. It's the kind of floor rate. But what's truly fascinating and really critical to understand here is how these tariffs are stacked, as the sources put it. Imagine you're importing, say, a high-tech component from China. You're not just paying that base cost. You could be stacking a Section 301 tariff, then maybe a Section 232 tariff if it contains steel, and then the fentanyl tariff on top of all that. Suddenly, your costs can easily more than double, maybe even triple. It drives up import costs significantly. And that forces businesses to completely rethink their supply chains, which then, cascades down to consumer prices eventually.
So the real takeaway isn't just about higher import costs, is it? It's how this really complex web of duties is fundamentally redesigning global supply chains and creating new, maybe often unintended economic dependencies or vulnerabilities across the world.
Exactly. This strategy, while it aims for boosting domestic manufacturing and cutting the trade deficit, is also seen as, quote, self-dealing in some analyses in our sources. It seems designed to draw investment away from other countries and directly into the U.S. Now, critics, according to our sources, argue it risks international backlash, a global cascade of subsidy wars. They suggest it might even violate the very trade principles the U.S. once championed, potentially undermining its global legitimacy. And the reports also highlight that these unilateral U.S. actions have reportedly led to declines in revenue, profitability, and even employment for affected U.S. firms. So it demonstrates these complex economic ripple effects. 3. Shifting geopolitical sands. Russia, China, and global alliances.
These aggressive economic maneuvers, though, they aren't happening in a vacuum, are they? They intertwine deeply with, and maybe even exacerbate, major geopolitical flashpoints, particularly concerning Russia and China, where you see new alliances forming and old orders being challenged. Let's talk about the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war and how a second Trump administration seems to be influencing it, based on our sources.
Well, Putin's strategic calculation, as our sources reveal, has really been to wait for war fatigue to set in. Among Ukrainians, yes, but also in the West. He truly believed that Western resolve, while it was initially strong, was weakening over time. And what's particularly revealing is that he explicitly, quote, waited for Trump to return to power. He calculated it would offer new opportunities and maybe legitimize his position on the global stage.
And it seems, according to the reports we have, his calculation might be proving out. Trump's administration has apparently revived U.S.-Russian contacts, negotiators meeting in Riyadh to discuss reestablishing political and economic relations and ending the war. But our sources state this is happening, quote, with no concessions from Russia and while it continues relentlessly bombing Ukraine. That detail, no concessions, that's quite significant, isn't it? What does that imply for the conflict in the West's position?
It's profoundly significant, yeah. From Putin's perspective, this normalization of ties is a huge bonus. It could grant him the legitimacy, the recognition he desires on the world stage, despite his ongoing aggression. For Ukraine and its Western allies, though, it could undermine the very principle that aggression cannot be rewarded, that you can't just invade a neighbor and then get normalized relations. This move also aligns with Putin's broader goal of disrupting the post-Cold War order, diminishing American power. Some analyses even suggest it could lead towards a sort of Yalta-type division of the world into spheres of influence, among Russia, the U.S., and China, reminiscent of post-World War II. Our sources even note that Trump has reportedly blamed Ukrainian President Zelensky for starting the war and for ingratitude towards past U.S. aid. Quite a statement.
Beyond Russia, then there's the critical issue of China-Taiwan relations. China views Taiwan as a breakaway territory, doesn't it? And hasn't ruled out using force for unification. They've ramped up military capabilities and these gray zone tactics, coercive actions that fall short of outright war, like restricting tourism or pressuring international groups to list Taiwan as a Chinese province. They seem to be constantly testing the boundaries without triggering a direct conflict.
That's exactly right. And the U.S. maintains this long-standing policy of strategic ambiguity with Taiwan, which means while they acknowledge China's one China position, they deliberately keep their commitment to Taiwan's defense kind of vague. They don't explicitly state whether they would intervene militarily if China attacked. This allows for flexibility, for deterrence, but as our sources point out, it's a really delicate balance that's increasingly tested by China's growing assertiveness. The U.S. does sell defense equipment to Taiwan, of course, and regularly sails ships through the Taiwan Strait, underlining its interest in regional stability. And as we discussed earlier, Trump has previously claimed he threatened to bomb Beijing if China invaded Taiwan, linking it back to that idea of preventing problems through extreme threats.
Right. So this brings us to a major debate presented in our sources. Which country actually poses the greater threat, immediate or long-term, to the United States? Our sources highlight that the Trump administration views China as the, quote, sole-pacing threat, prioritizing resources there. But is that view universally held?
Not at all, no. This is a point of considerable debate among the experts detailed in our sources. While the Trump administration focuses heavily on China as the primary challenge, other analyses argue Russia poses a greater immediate danger. Their reasoning includes Russia's vast nuclear arsenal, something like 5,580 warheads, compared to China's estimated 600. That's a huge difference. There's also Russia's demonstrated willingness to use military force. Look at Ukraine, Georgia, Syria, and its active disinformation campaigns targeting U.S. elections. Furthermore, the deep economic integration between the U.S. and Europe's role as a key treaty ally, while it means Russian aggression in Europe would directly threaten U.S. national security and the stability of global alliances. So it's a really complex risk calculation with very different conclusions depending on who you ask. Thorvi, the legal question of nuclear weapons.
Given Russia's recent brandishing of nuclear threats, as some sources put it, and modifying its doctrine to lower the threshold for their use, which implies a greater willingness to maybe consider using them. What does international law actually say about all this? It feels like we're constantly hovering on the edge of a very, very dangerous discussion.
It's a crucial question, and it's one the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, addressed back in its 1996 advisory opinion. On the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons, the court's finding was quite nuanced, actually. It found no specific treaty or customary international law that definitively prohibits the threat or use of nuclear weapons as such. However, and this is key, it emphasized that the fundamental principles of international humanitarian law do apply. That includes things like distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants and avoiding unnecessary suffering. The court indicated that because of the unique characteristics of nuclear weapons, their immense destructive power, the suffering they cause, their potential to destroy the environment, their use seems scarcely reconcilable with that body of humanitarian law.
Okay. Scarcely reconcilable. So what did they definitively conclude then? Did they give a clear yes or no on legality?
Not entirely, no. They could not definitively conclude whether the threat or use of nuclear weapons would be lawful or unlawful in an extreme circumstance of self-defense in which the very survival of a state would be at stake. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? That despite all our international frameworks, the ultimate question of nuclear use still rests in this sort of terrifyingly undefined gray area. They also stated there is an ongoing obligation for all states to pursue good faith negotiations leading towards nuclear disarmament. But fundamentally, it leaves this critical, undefined gray area in international law, which makes the current nuclear rhetoric from various actors all the more precarious.
Wow. What a deep dive into a world that's just constantly being reshaped by ambitious foreign policies, escalating trade measures, shifting global alliances, from those direct diplomatic threats that seem to redefine deterrence to the complex, stacking layers of tariffs fundamentally altering global supply chains and this very real ongoing debate about global threats. It's clear the international landscape is anything but static.
Absolutely. The dynamics we've discussed today, that America First approach with its aggressive directness, the economic pressures exerted through tariffs on China, the contentious normalization of relations with Russia, and the ongoing tensions in key regions, they all underscore a significant departure from traditional international relations. These policies are designed, clearly, to achieve very specific outcomes for the U.S. But as we've explored, they come with complex and sometimes unintended consequences for allies and rivals alike. The true takeaway isn't just about what is happening, I think, but how these actions are fundamentally challenging the very foundations of the global order that's been built over decades.
So what does this all mean for you listening? Well, it means paying close attention to how these actions impact global stability, economic relationships, even the products you buy and the jobs potentially tied to international trade. The lines between economic policy, military strategy, and diplomatic rhetoric seem blurrier than ever. It really demands a more nuanced understanding of global events, doesn't it?
It does, and it raises an important final question, perhaps. In a world where great powers seem increasingly willing to weaponize trade and diplomacy, and where the threat of nuclear conflict remains, disturbingly, in a legal gray area, what is the long-term impact on global cooperation and on the future of international order itself?
Something for you to consider as you navigate the news and conversations around you. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this has given you a clearer, perhaps more informed perspective on these really critical global shifts.